I think architecture is actually an important part of a community. And I know you've been involved in architecture for decades. I know you've been involved with civil service. You've been mayor.
Right,
You were town administrator. So
right,
I thought I'd talk to you about architecture. So
sure.
what when did you decide to become an architect? And can you tell us about your history and your career as an architect?
Sure. Well, I was living in Minnesota, going to a Bible college. It was a 2-year course. And afterwards, I was trying to think of what I was going to do. And I had a friend, I was working construction in the summertime. And I had a friend who was taking a drafting class, and he was talking to me about it. And I decided to go to a community college and take an architectural technology class. And I just so happened the second semester take this kind of a 3D test, like there was like 500 questions or whatever, and you had to like figure out these different shapes, and which one was the right answer on like these unfolded box type of shapes. And I got all of them right. And so my teacher, who was an architect, said you should go to architecture school. Somehow I had good 3D perception or something. So I said, how do I do that? He said, well, you got to take all these classes, physics and calculus, and all these pre-architecture classes, and then apply to the University of Minnesota College of Architecture. So I did, and I got accepted, and that's been my life story. I never thought I would get accepted. I never thought I'd graduate. Never thought I'd get my license. Every step along the way, I just felt like were these huge hurdles that I wasn't really quite sure how I was going to do it. I was living out in Minnesota. I had a big family back here in West Springfield. Grew up in a family of 9 kids, and so not a lot of big support out there when I was living out there. But yeah, I managed to make it through. Delved into different things, like I organized a group of students to go to study classical Chinese architecture in Beijing back in 1984, in the heavy midst of communism, people living in dire poverty and things like that, and really saw a lot of different things, so I kind of was always quite adventurous. And so I graduated, went back to Taiwan, the Republic of China, which was at the time was a dictatorship, a one-party rule system. And I worked for an architect there, taught English as a second language, and basically traveled around and goofed around, after spending so many years in college, 6 years in architecture school. So, and then I decided I wanted to live in a city that I didn't need to own a car. So I applied in Boston, I applied in New York City. And in New York City, there were 2 pages of want ads, and I got a job working for the largest architecture firm in New York City. And the first project I worked on was 7 World Trade, which fell down on 9/11 with the terrorist attack, And so I was in New York City for about 5 to 6 years. And then I got married down there and my wife and I decided to move up to West Springfield when the real estate market had completely crashed. So I put out my shingle and started doing architecture work. I taught at Stick for 5.5 years as an adjunct faculty, and I taught at Boston Architectural College for 2.5 years. So I decided to try to stay in the academic part of it a little bit. But yeah, I've been doing this for about 35 years with interims as mayor and as town administrator. But yeah, and I always felt like the civic part of everything was so important. I was on the Board of Appeals in West Springfield for 16 years, chairman for a while. I was the chair of the Historic District Commission in West Springfield for 12 years, former president of the Rotary Club, former president of the American Institute of Architects for Western Massachusetts. So, I've always felt like you should stay involved, right? And and I guess that's when I was on the Board of Appeals, that really very directly related to architecture, because not only do we do design of buildings, but we do site plan things. And we're also taught city planning and, community building. And so I saw when I was on the Board of Appeals how poorly people were treated, especially mom and pop type of people, by the board. And somehow they always felt like they're protecting the town from the citizens, which to me was just crazy, right? You're not protecting the town, you're serving the citizens, right? So as if the town was like some entity or something that was being going to be harmed by the citizens. So and a lot of entrepreneurs, they wanted to build or renovate or start a business. I call it mom and pop, but really, literally, some of them were probably in their early 60s trying to start a business, and they had to jump through all these hoops with the town planners and planning department. I saw that in East Longmeadow also, not just West Springfield, but East Longmeadow too. And go ahead, next question. I'll let you jump in.
Well, I was going to say, before we started talking, I was listening to the school committee talk about what they're going to do with the high school. Are they going to renovate it? Are they going to redesign it? Are they going to build a new high school? And they're going on about, okay, we're in this phase and we have to move to this phase and on, this whole big process. And then you look at the end result in many of these cases, and you're like, how did we end up with this at the end of all of this work? So just to give you a few examples, I know the courthouse has been in the news. The courthouse to me just looks like a cement block with some windows in it. My daughter's school, she goes to Meadowbrook School here in East Longmeadow. It almost looks like a brick chicken coop, right? So these things must have been through the whole gamut. And then at the end of it, you're presented with something that's really kind of ugly, So can you explain the process, how it works, and how we get what we end up with?
Well, I'll give you an example. When I was in architecture school, my teachers were taught under modernism, which came about around the 1920s, 1930s. These, Corbusier and other people. And Frank Lloyd Wright in the late 1800s and Louis Sullivan, these other architects, were really kind of in the arts and crafts type of movement and, really hands-on. And if you go into these old houses in Springfield and stuff, you say, oh, look at all this woodwork. Those are a bunch of Italian immigrants who were brought in, paid almost nothing, right? And they would go in and just carve away at the wood, right? Well, you really couldn't do that anymore. So industrialism brought in this kind of like stripped down and factory made furniture and kind of buildings too, right? So you kind of got we would look at a warehouse or a Butler pre-engineered building, and we'd say, okay, well, that doesn't look very appealing. It's, and then but that's exactly what modernism was doing. They were trying to get rid of all ornamentation. They thought it was horrible. Those are the type of teachers I had. And if you were to put an arch in your building, an arch window in your building, they would just go crazy, And really, architecture is taught almost like a religion. And most people don't understand that. But it's an art and it's a science. But really, it's taught with these teachers who have very, very strong opinions. So what happens is that you get like the courthouse in Springfield, right? That was done by quite a famous architect, and the style is called brutalism. Well, you look at it and say, that looks pretty brutal, right? All this concrete, right? Yeah. The same thing with the student center at UMass, right? That was done by Marcel Breuer, which I worked for his office in New York City. And again, heavy concrete. They were still doing it when I worked for their office in New York City. And but it's a style, and it has a certain feel to it. It's not just a brick 3-story building with punched windows or whatever. So it definitely has a certain style to it. And believe me, that building can be renovated if they think the mechanical system, just totally gut the whole building and let the structure stay and renovate it. It's not that difficult to do, but people think these sick buildings nothing can be done about it, but they can.
So, architecture, it's kind of like other cultural things where we've seen the pendulum swing all the way to one side, like you said, with your professors, and it's almost just stayed there. There's been no swing back to, more traditional architectural styles
you do see it, like Kalo Mbinic, Curtis Edgen, who's the owner, did the Chicopee Public Library.
Mhm.
And that was very nicely done. You see these arches, you see the brick, you see detail, right? And so it is coming back. There was a book written in the 1960s and early 70s, um, uh, uh, one called "Learning from Las Vegas," and this Robert Venturi was the architect that wrote these books, and he had these sayings like "Main Street is almost all right." Like the old details from the late 1800s and stuff like that, they're almost okay. And learning from Las Vegas, he was showing how kind of all this Americana, kind of this crazy stuff. And if you ever went down Riverdale Road in West Springfield, where there was like A&W, there was the Big Boy, there were these huge signs and kind of like these buildings as sign or whatever, like the dinosaur building out west,
Yeah.
Where the building shaped like a hot dog, a hot dog stand or whatever, and all this kind of Americana. He was pointing out that it has a certain kind of cultural value to it, that people find appealing. And that's the thing that the intellectuals really missed out. Sure, they were doing industrialization, so everyone could go to Macy's and buy basically a piece of art, for a middle class budget, right? And you didn't have to go to a famous artist to make something for you, custom made, your own, right? And that was their idea. So they did have some good ideas about using industrialization to bring art to everybody, right? But they lost the soul. And of course, all these people were Marxists, communists, blah, 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 right? Mm-hmm. And that's really the hallmark of Marxism, is the loss of the soul, right? Mm-hmm. And they want to kind of impose things on people or whatever. So, right, Main Street's almost all right. The kind of like basic feelings that people have. Why do I like things? Why do I don't like things? Right? You get into this whole intellectual thing and you forget about that. Right? So, yeah.
So, all my life, I've never thought of architecture. And then in law school, I went to law school in Rhode Island and I lived in Newport, and the architecture there is beautiful. And they're very strict on what they allowed to be done with their buildings and their houses. And it wasn't so I went there. I went to Roger Williams University. They had a school of architecture. I used to go through the library. And I remember there was a brand new Salve Regina. The university had a new library, and it was a weird building, but it was beautiful. It had sort of a Gothic look to it, with stone on the outside, but it also
I lost you there for a second.
Okay, so I was talking about the library at Salve Regina, which was modern with glass and steel, but also it had a Gothic look to it. It was very pretty. I come back home here and there's little to no, stuff that I could look at and say, wow, isn't that impressive? I used to be very proud when people came to visit me and I could show them the buildings and the area I was living in. So what do you think, what is the purpose of architecture, public architecture, public buildings? Is it about utility, or is it about sort of inspiring pride in the people, or both? What's your view on that?
Well, you go back to a very, very ancient saying: firmness, commodity, and delight. That was Vitruvius said that, an ancient Roman architect, right? Firmness.
Yeah.
It has to stand up. It has to be strong. It can't fall down. That's firmness. Commodity means it has to be economical in some ways. You have to meet your budget. Mm-hmm. And delight means it has to be beautiful, right? So those are the three kind of principles of architecture that were laid out in ancient times. And it still applies today, and you say to people, you can have two or three things. You can have budget, schedule, or sorry, the third one, I need more coffee, I guess this morning. Budget, schedule, and the other one, I'll get to it. You can edit that one out.
Firmness.
Firmness, commodity, and delight. It follows those three, right?
Yep.
So basically architecture is really, we have a strong architectural history in our education, and you try to bring something beautiful to people. But buildings are very strange in some ways, because if you've ever been in an empty building, it really feels kind of weird. There's no people occupying it. And if you've been into like an empty house, to me, it even feels kind of even stranger, right? That somehow this was built and people lived here and they had their lives there. And when you're living in your house, it's like becomes like an extension of who you are, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe that's why Jesus used that example. When an evil spirit is cast out of a house, it comes back and finds 7 more evil than themselves, and then comes back to that house. Almost like a house is like a person in some ways, that can be possessed, if you might say that, right? And and also how we perceive, one thing about modernism is that they pointed out space and time. And that's how we perceive buildings, right? Is that you pull up to a building, you get out of your car, you see the building, right? You have an impression of it. You walk up to the building, you kind of enter the door, you come into the building. All that is space and time, right? And they were very good in pointing that out, kind of psychologically, how human beings experience buildings, right? So, and they've actually done studies where people are asked to memorize something, okay? 2 groups of people. One group stays in the room, the other one goes into the next room. The people who went to the next room did worse on the memorization test than the people who stayed in the room. And somehow they say when you pass from one room to another, it does something to your brain. And so, that's kind of this whole thing about how you perceive things. So then modern architecture, or we say contemporary with our technology, we can do these huge spaces, right? We can do all kinds of different things. And when we're in architecture school, they did very well in teaching us about, how do people perceive the space, right? And how are you going to design that? And how can you improve that and things? So yeah, there are some pluses of modern architecture education. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Greg, thanks a lot for your time.
Okay.
It was a good chat, like always, with you. Keep in touch in the future. I'd love to talk to you again as I go forward with this blog.
Absolutely. And Justin, it's great of you to do shows like this, and it's great to see you participating in East Longmeadow and in the different issues of East Longmeadow. I think it's very, very important.
Thanks a lot, Greg. I appreciate it.
Okay, we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. Okay. Have a good morning.
You too. Take care.
Take care.